It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of day when the neighborhood felt almost too perfect. The sun painted the rows of manicured lawns in gold, sprinklers ticked rhythmically, and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass. For James, a hardworking contractor, this neighborhood was supposed to be a reward for years of sweat and sacrifice. He had worked overtime shifts, poured his energy into building a successful small business, and when the time came, he chose this community for its promise of safety, peace, and belonging. That morning, James walked outside with a cup of coffee in hand. His pride and joy, a silver Ford F-250 pickup truck, was parked in the driveway. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was the backbone of his business. The truck had hauled lumber for his construction jobs, delivered equipment to clients, and carried the tools that built his livelihood. To him, the truck was a symbol of independence, of a life built through calloused hands and perseverance. But something was different that day. A folded slip of paper was wedged beneath his windshield wiper. At first, James thought it was an advertisement, maybe a flyer left by a landscaping company or real estate agent. But as he pulled it free and unfolded it, his stomach tightened. The letterhead was unmistakable. Homeowners Association. The message was short, but sharp. His pickup truck was in violation of community guidelines. The HOA claimed it was too large, unsightly, and inconsistent with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. They demanded he park it out of sight or face daily fines. James stared at the notice, disbelief washing over him. Nowhere in the glossy brochures that sold him this dream neighborhood had there been a warning about pickup trucks. Nowhere in the welcome packet had he seen restrictions against the very vehicle that paid his mortgage. Yet here it was, in black and white, his livelihood deemed unacceptable, reduced to nothing more than a nuisance in the eyes of people who had likely never hauled a single plank of wood in their lives. Over the next few days, more letters followed. Each one grew sterner, citing sections of the HOA's rulebook, threatening, escalating fines. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a full-on demand. Park the truck in the garage, hide it away, or pay up. But James's garage was too small to fit a vehicle of that size, and he wasn't about to rent an expensive off-site storage space just to appease a handful of board members. Soon, the neighbors began to notice. Some offered sympathetic looks, muttering about how the HOA had been cracking down harder than ever. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved. And then there were those who seemed to revel in it, the kind who nodded approvingly as board members walked by. The ones who lived for rules and regulations. At the center of it all was Margaret, the HOA president. She had made a reputation for herself as the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics. She was the type who measured lawn heights with a ruler, who scolded children for leaving bikes in driveways, who treated every minor infraction as a personal crusade, and now she had set her sights on James's truck. What made the situation worse was that James wasn't the only one with a truck. Several homes in the community had SUVs, vans, and even smaller pickups parked outside. Yet none of them received letters. None of them were singled out. It was clear this wasn't about rules, was about targeting. For reasons James didn't yet understand, Margaret had chosen him. The fines began to arrive in the mail. $50, then $100, then $200. Each notice was like a slap in the face, a reminder that someone was profiting off his frustration. James appealed to the board, but his pleas were dismissed with cold formality. They cited bylaws and rules, twisting language to suit their agenda. At night, James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mounting fines. He felt anger, frustration, and a gnawing sense of injustice. How could they dictate what he parked in his own driveway? How could they strip him of the very tool that allowed him to work and live in this neighborhood? Yet, beneath the anger, a spark began to form. James had faced worse before: customers who refused to pay, projects that went sideways, years when work dried up and bills piled high. He had never given up then, and he won't give up now. If the HOA thought they could bully him into submission, they were sorely mistaken. James was a builder by trade, but more importantly, he was a fighter by nature. He would not only challenge their ruling, he would make them regret ever picking this battle. The notice on his windshield was not the end. It was the beginning of a war, and James was already planning how to win it. The first fines were almost laughable, a nuisance more than a real threat. James tossed the letters into a drawer, determined not to let them ruin his day. But soon, the tone of the notices shifted. What began as $50 charges ballooned into hundreds. Threats of legal action filled the envelopes, stamped in bold red lettering. The HOA was no longer just wagging a finger. They were baring their teeth. Margaret, the HOA president, made her presence known with an unsettling persistence. She began patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, scribbling furiously whenever she passed James's home. Sometimes she would stop, glaring at his driveway, as though his truck were a monument to rebellion. Word spread quickly that she had bragged at board meetings about making an example out of him. Neighbors whispered cautiously. Some admired James's resolve, quietly encouraging him to stand firm. Others, fearful of retaliation, avoided him altogether. A few took Margaret's side, parroting her claims that pickup trucks lowered property values and ruined curb appeal. To James it was absurd. His truck wasn't a rusted eyesore, it was clean, well-kept, and newer than half the cars in the neighborhood. But to Margaret, it was a symbol of defiance. The situation escalated when James received a certified letter warning of a lien on his home if he didn't pay the accumulating fines. His stomach dropped as he read the words. They weren't just threatening his truck anymore. They were threatening his house, his sanctuary, his family's future. It was a line he couldn't allow them to cross. James knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. That night, he dug out the HOA's bylaws and pored over every line. The documents were a maze of legal jargon, loopholes, and contradictions. But buried within the dense text, James found something interesting. The section Margaret had cited against his truck was vague, painfully vague. It prohibited oversized vehicles detrimental to community aesthetics. But nowhere did it define what qualified as oversized. There were no measurements, no specifics, no clear limits. The rule was a gray area, open to interpretation, and Margaret had twisted it to her own advantage. Armed with this discovery, James filed a formal appeal. He attended the next HOA meeting, his presence drawing curious stares from neighbors who rarely showed up. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members, her expression smug as James made his case. He laid out the facts clearly. His truck was legal, properly registered, and no different in size than many vehicles already parked in the neighborhood. He pointed out the vagueness of the bylaws and questioned why he had been singled out while others went unpunished. The room stirred with murmurs, some in agreement, others uneasy. But Margaret was ready. She leaned on her authority, dismissing his points as irrelevant and declaring his truck a clear violation. The board, cowed by her presence, voted in lockstep to uphold the fines. The gavel came down, and the matter was declared settled. James walked out of the meeting fuming, but more determined than ever. If Margaret thought she had won, she was sorely mistaken. What Sid Dean realized was that James had already started gathering evidence. He began documenting everything: photos of other large vehicles in the neighborhood, copies of the vague bylaw, even videos of Margaret's obsessive patrols. He kept records of every fine, every letter, every unreasonable demand. Piece by piece, he built a case, not just against the rule, but against the board itself. At the same time, he reached out for help. A lawyer friend pointed him towards state laws protecting homeowners from overreaching HOA boards. He learned that vague bylaws often failed in court, especially when selectively enforced. He also discovered that HOAs could be held liable for harassment, misuse of funds, and discriminatory enforcement of rules. The more James learned, the clearer his path became. This wasn't just about saving his truck. It was about exposing corruption, about proving that the HOA wasn't above the law. But Margaret wasn't blind to his defiance. As weeks passed, the pressure intensified. Notices arrived daily, each one more aggressive than the last. Threats of towing, escalating fines, and legal action piled up. One morning, James even found a bright orange sticker slapped on his windshield, warning that his truck would be forcibly removed if he didn't comply. That was the breaking point. James peeled the sticker off, his jaw tight with resolve. The HOA wanted a fight. They had won, and he was no longer playing defense. From that moment forward, he would go on the offensive. The war over his pickup truck was only beginning, and James was ready to make the HOA pay not just in letters and fines, but in ways they could never have imagined. James had always believed in fairness, in the idea that if you worked hard and followed the law, you should be left alone. But Margaret and her HOA board had crossed a line. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were targeting him, twisting vague guidelines into weapons, and threatening his very home. Now, it was his turn to fight back. The first step was exposure. James began reaching out to local media outlets. At first, the reporter sounded hesitant. HOA disputes weren't exactly headline material, but once James explained the situation, backed by photos and documents, curiosity grew. The idea of a homeowners association threatening a working man's livelihood because of a pickup truck struck a chord. Within days, a local news crew arrived, cameras in hand, to interview him in front of the very truck the HOA despised. James stood by his driveway as the reporter asked questions. He explained how the HOA fines had ballooned into thousands, how vague rules had been selectively enforced, and how he was being harassed for simply owning a vehicle essential to his work. The story aired that evening, and by morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The segment painted James as a hardworking man standing up against an overreaching HOA. Neighbors who had stayed silent now whispered about the injustice, emboldened by the spotlight. Some even began sharing their own grievances: fines for lawn colors, threats over Christmas decorations, warnings for leaving garbage cans out a few minutes too long. It wasn't just James. Margaret's reign of control had cast a shadow over everyone, but publicity was only one weapon in James's arsenal. Behind the scenes, he and his lawyer began preparing a legal case. They gathered evidence, showing how other large vehicles, SUV, vans, and even another pickup remained untouched while his truck was targeted. They documented Margaret's obsessive patrols, her comments about making an example of him, and the escalating threats. The selective enforcement was clear as day, and in court vagueness favored the homeowner, not the Margaret, however, wasn't backing down. If anything, the media attention seemed to inflame her. She doubled her patrols, glared openly at James whenever they crossed paths, and even sent new letters claiming his truck was a commercial vehicle, which the HOA also supposedly banned. It didn't matter that James had no company logos on it, no external equipment racks, nothing that made it anything other than a personal vehicle. Margaret simply moved the goalposts, inventing new justifications to keep the pressure on. But each new letter, each absurd claim, only added more weight to James's growing case. He kept every document, photographed every sticker, and built a timeline of harassment so thorough that even a sympathetic HOA judge would struggle to ignore it. Then came the turning point. James filed an official lawsuit, not only challenging the fines, but accusing the HOA of harassment and misuse of authority. The filing sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Many residents had lived under the HOA's thumb for years, but had never dared to take them on legally. Now, James was doing what no one else had. The man with the pickup truck had become a symbol of resistance. The media seized on the development, and soon, larger outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, "Contractor fights HOA over pickup truck ban and HOA faces lawsuit after targeting veteran worker's vehicle." James's story spread across social media, drawing thousands of supportive comments from people who had faced their own HOA nightmares. The pressure mounted. Margaret found herself cornered, her once unquestioned authority challenged not only by James, but by the very residents she had lorded over 4 years. Whispers of recall elections swirled through the community. Neighbors who had once feared her began discussing the possibility of removing her and the board entirely. Still, Margaret refused to relent. She clung to her clipboard, patrolled with even more fervor, and treated James' defiance as a personal but the cracks in her empire were showing. At meetings, residents began questioning decisions more openly. At gatherings, people spoke James's name with admiration. The narrative was shifting, and Margaret could feel her grip slipping. For James, the fight was far from over. The court date loomed, and while he felt confident, he knew anything could happen once lawyers and judges got involved. Still, he had the law on his side, the media at his back, and the support of a growing number of neighbors. As he stood in his driveway one evening, Watching the sunset glint off the chrome of his truck, James felt a surge of determination. The HOA thought they could bleed him dry with fines, but now it was their turn to pay. And he wasn't just aiming for reimbursement, he was aiming for a reckoning. The battle lines were drawn, and James was ready to strike the next blow. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were tense, a waiting game charged with anticipation. James went about his daily work, hauling lumber, pouring concrete, and driving his truck to job sites, but the looming trial weighed on him like a storm cloud. Every evening, he'd sit at his kitchen table, stacks of documents spread before him, letters from the photographs of other large vehicles in the neighborhood, and screenshots of the vague, ambiguous bylaws that Margaret had weaponized. His lawyer, a sharp and seasoned man with years of HOA litigation experience, coached him carefully. They built their case on two pillars: the vagueness of the bylaw, and the blatant selective enforcement. Both were powerful arguments, but it was the narrative James, as a hardworking man, targeted for no reason, that gave the case emotional weight. And with the media watching, that narrative would matter. The morning of the hearing arrived. James woke before dawn, his stomach knotted with nerves. He put on his cleanest suit, one he had worn 2 weddings and formal occasions, and drove ironically in the very truck the HOA wanted banned to the courthouse. When he pulled into the parking lot, news vans were already lined up, cameras trained on the entrance. His story had struck a chord, and now the public wanted to see it play out. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat James with his lawyer.com, but resolute. On the other side was Margaret and the HOA's attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone used to intimidating opponents. Margaret sat stiffly, her arms crossed, her face etched with disdain. She avoided eye contact with James, her jaw clenched tightly. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Papers rustled, whispers faded, and the battle began. The HOA's lawyer went first, laying out their case with a flourish of legal language. He described the HOA as the guardian of community standards, tasked with maintaining property values and protecting the neighborhood's appearance. He argued that James's truck violated the aesthetic harmony of the community, citing the bylaw about oversized vehicles. To him, the case was cut and dry. James had broken the rules, and the HOA had acted within its rights. But when James's lawyer stood, the tone shifted. He calmly dismantled the HOA's argument, piece by piece. He held up the bylaw in question, reading aloud its vague wording, emphasizing how it lacked any concrete definitions. He presented photographs of other vehicles in the neighborhood as UVS, vans, even another truck that were of equal or greater size, none of which had been cited. He introduced copies of Margaret's letters, highlighting the language that bordered on harassment. Then came the human element. James's lawyer painted a picture of a man who had worked tirelessly to build his life, whose truck was not a luxury but a necessity. He argued that the HOA had overreached, abusing its authority to target James unfairly, and in doing so, had caused financial and emotional harm. When James himself took the stand, he spoke plainly and from the heart. He described the first notice on his windshield, the avalanche of fines, the threats of lien, and the fear of losing his home. He spoke of his work, how his truck was essential, and how being singled out made him feel like a criminal in his own neighborhood. His words weren't polished, but they were raw, and the courtroom listened. Margaret, too, was called to testify. She carried herself with the same arrogance she displayed in the neighborhood, insisting that the rules were clear and that James had willfully broken them. But under cross-examination, cracks began to show. When asked to define oversized vehicle, she stumbled. When confronted with photos of other large vehicles in the community, she grew defensive, claiming they didn't count for various flimsy reasons. Her bias was evident, her answers inconsistent, and the judge took notice. By the end of the day, the contrast was stark. On one side, a man who just wanted to park his truck in peace. On TOTR, an HOA president who seemed more concerned with control than fairness. The judge announced that he would deliberate and deliver a ruling in the coming weeks. The gavel struck, and the room exhaled. As James left the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, microphones thrust toward his face. He kept his answers simple, thanking his lawyer and expressing faith in the system. Behind him, Margaret stormed out, her once commanding presence diminished under the weight of public scrutiny. Back in the neighborhood, the tension only grew. Residents gathered in driveways, whispering about the trial, speculating on the outcome. Some openly expressed support for James, while others, once loyal to Margaret, began questioning whether she had gone too far. For James, the waiting was agonizing, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever the judge decided, he had already won in one way. He had stood up to the HOA, exposed their overreach, and inspired others to question authority that had long gone unchallenged. The verdict was coming, and James was ready. The weeks of waiting were the hardest. Every day, James went about his routine, working long hours, coming home exhausted, parking his truck in the same driveway that had started it all. But the looming decision hung over him like a storm cloud. Neighbors greeted him differently now. Some nodded with respect, others whispered as he passed. His fight had become bigger than just one man and a truck. It was a referendum on the HOA itself. When the day finally came, the courtroom was fuller than before. Residents from James's community had shown up, some to support him, others out of morbid curiosity. Reporters packed the benches, cameras waiting outside to capture every reaction. James sat with his lawyer, his palms damp with sweat, his heart pounding. Across the aisle, Margaret sat rigid, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes locked straight ahead. The judge entered, and silence swept the room. His words were deliberate, measured, and heavy with finality. He began by addressing the HOA's arguments, acknowledging their role in maintaining community standards. But then his tone shifted. The bylaw they had used against James, he said, was fatally vague, offering no clear definitions of what constituted an oversized vehicle. Rules that lacked clarity could not be enforced fairly. Next came the matter of selective enforcement. The judge referenced the photographs. James had provided images of SUVs, vans, and trucks equal in size to his own, none of which had been cited. The inconsistency, the judge said, was damning. Enforcement of rules must be uniform, not selective or personal. Finally, he addressed the harassment, the mounting fines, the threatening letters, the towing warnings, and the lien threats had crossed the line from enforcement into intimidation. The judge called it an abuse of authority that undermined the purpose of an HOA. Then came the ruling. The fines against James were nullified in their entirety. The HOA was barred from taking any further action against his truck. And, in a devastating blow to the board, the HOA was ordered to reimburse James's legal fees, tens of thousands of dollars, that would come directly from the association's funds. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted. Supporters applauded, reporters scribbled furiously, and neighbors exchanged shocked glances. Margaret sat frozen, her face pale, empire crumbling in front of her. James didn't celebrate outwardly. He simply nodded, shook his lawyer's hand, and exhaled the breath he had been holding for weeks. Relief washed over him, not just for himself, but for everyone who had lived under Margaret's thumb. News of the verdict spread like wildfire. Headlines captured the story. Homeowner defeats HOA in pickup truck battle. Judge rules HOA overstepped authority. An HOA ordered to pay thousands after harassing resident. The media painted James as the underdog who had stood his ground and won, and the public loved it. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. Residents gathered in driveways, openly discussing the case. Many expressed admiration for James, calling him brave for standing up when so many had been too afraid. Some, who had quietly endured their own battles with the began digging into their own notices and fines, questioning whether they too had been unfairly treated. For Margaret, the verdict was a humiliation she couldn't hide from. Her leadership, ironclad, was now under fire. Neighbors muttered about her obsession, her misuse of power, and the thousands of dollars she had cost them all. Rumors of a recall election circulated, and for the first time, Margaret found herself isolated, the loyalty of her board members crumbling under pressure. James, meanwhile, tried to return to normal life. He parked his truck in his driveway each night, unbothered and unafraid. But nothing felt quite the same. Where once he had been just another homeowner, he was now the man who had taken down the HOA. His fight had sparked something bigger, a movement within the neighborhood, and possibly beyond. Yet even in victory, James sensed the war wasn't fully over. The HOA was wounded, but not dead. Margaret was humiliated, but not gone, and the road to rebuilding trust in the neighborhood would be long. The verdict had been delivered, the balance of power had shifted, and the HOA had been forced to pay dearly. But the question remained: what would happen next, when the dust settled and neighbors decided the future of their community? The weeks following the verdict felt surreal. For the first time in months, James could park his truck in the driveway without dreading a new notice tucked under his windshield. Each morning, he'd sip his coffee by the window, watching the sun glint off the hood of his Ford F-250, and feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had beaten them. What had started as a petty HOA demand had ended in a courtroom victory, a story told on the evening news, and a neighborhood forever changed. But peace didn't come immediately. The fallout rippled through the community like a stone thrown into still water. The HOA, forced to pay James's legal fees, sent out letters announcing increased dues to cover the financial hit. That decision sparked outrage. Neighbors who had once tolerated Margaret's strict rule now openly questioned her judgment. Why should they all pay for her crusade against a single homeowner? Whispers turned into open conversations. Driveway gatherings became heated debates. Soon, petitions circulated calling for a recall of the HOA board. James didn't lead the charge, he didn't have to. His victory had emboldened others to stand up. Long silent residents began speaking about their own grievances. Fines for leaving trash cans out an hour too long, warnings about holiday decorations, letters about paint colors that were slightly off. The neighborhood had endured Margaret's reign for years, but now they had proof that her power could be broken. The recall meeting was unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. The community center overflowed with residents, voices raised, tempers hot. Margaret sat at the front, her once commanding presence diminished. When she attempted to defend herself, citing her dedication to protecting property values, the crowd erupted in boos and jeers. One by one, residents spoke out, recounting the petty fines, the harassment, the humiliation. James's victory had opened the floodgates. When the vote came, the result was decisive. Margaret was removed as HOA president. Several of her closest allies on the board were ousted as well. In their place, new members were elected neighbors who promised transparency, fairness, and a focus on community rather than control. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't feared, it was held accountable. Margaret's downfall was swift. Stripped of her authority, she became a pariah in the very neighborhood she once ruled. Her walks, once filled with note-taking and glaring, now drew cold stares and whispered criticisms. Wheaton Monser House went up for sale. The for sale sign on her lawn felt symbolic, the final chapter of her reign. Eventually, she moved away, leaving behind only bitter memories. As for James, life slowly returned to normal. His truck remained in the driveway, untouched and unchallenged. Neighbors who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly, some even thanking him for standing up when no one else dared. To many, he wasn't just James the contractor anymore. He was James, the man who had taken on the HOA and won. But James never sought glory. For him, it was about principle. It was about refusing to be bullied, about proving that rules must be fair, and that no one should be singled out for personal vendettas. His victory was personal, but it had reshaped the neighborhood in ways he hadn't expected. Months later, when the media revisited the story, James stood once again in front of his home, the truck gleaming in the driveway. He spoke simply, reflecting on the journey. He didn't talk about fines or lawsuits or even Margaret. Instead, he talked about freedom, the freedom to live peacefully in one's home, to work hard without interference, and to park a truck without fear of harassment. And as the camera panned across the street, capturing the flags, decorations, and yes, the other trucks now proudly parked in driveways, it was clear that this neighborhood had changed. The shadow of control had lifted, replaced by something closer to the community spirit it had once promised. James's fight had started with a single notice on his windshield. It ended with justice served, a neighborhood freed, and an HOA forced to pay thousands for its overreach. For James, that was enough. The war was over, the battle won, and peace at last.